Hi folks, and welcome back to API CAN Codes Unit 1, Data in Learners' Lives. Today we're going to talk about Lesson 2, Data Collection and its Purpose and Impact. In this lesson, the primary goal is to introduce students to different stakeholders who might care about collecting their data and their motivations. Students will spend some time discussing collectors of data in their own lives and discussing privacy and bias issues. The first thing we're going to have students do is warm up by brainstorming 5 sources of data in their life, or they might have already generated those in the last lesson to use for today's lesson. Why we build in time here is for students who maybe didn't do that last time or weren't really happy with their list from last time to come up with some new ideas. So in all of the lessons after the first one, we try to recap the previous lesson. So here's a brief slide just recapping what we talked about there. We also talk about the different data types specifically that we talked about in lesson 1, so students can recall what those are. On this and the next slide, we have students explore the Data Never Sleeps website, which seeks to quantify data that's created and consumed every minute of every day on the internet. We have a Google Forms icon here noting again that students are responding to a question on the worksheet for this slide. What we start students off with is looking at Data Never Sleeps 1.0, which is a version from about a decade ago, and then compare that to the most recent version, 11.0. On this slide, we ask students 2 questions. What kinds of data are being created, and did this website make you think of any new kinds of data? Hopefully this is building on last class's discussion about different kinds of data that our learners are aware of in their own lives. On this slide, our prompt is about who might collect or care about some of these data streams. Encourage students to think about lots of different stakeholders that might be interested in their or others' data. This might include businesses like Amazon targeting relevant product ads, or social media companies like Instagram and TikTok also sometimes trying to serve up relevant product ads, but also other forms of personalized content. Might also include people like political analysts who are trying to predict voting patterns and a whole bunch of other options. We've also got some takeaways here at the closing of this Data Never Sleeps activity. Now that we've started thinking about data collectors, we're going to return to the list of sources of data that students came up with in their own lives from the warm-up. For each of the data set sources that they identified, they're going to come up with at least one collector for each source, someone that might be interested in collecting the data that they create or consume. To aim for a slightly broader perspective, we asked students to consider a couple different folks around the world and how each of these people might use data in different ways and what kinds of data they might create and consume. Next, we have a few questions about data and privacy. We're focusing in on data collectors and how they're using data and whether that seems to violate user privacy. So we start with an example from TikTok, accessing your location, contact info, browsing history, and other usage data, and being able to share this data with other apps or websites. We recommend framing this as a class debate with different parts of the class forming arguments for whether this is or is not a privacy violation. The nice thing about doing this as a debate is it can promote some more engagement in the class and have them sort of try to defend each side of the argument. Our second situation involves a Ring camera. So in this case, a neighbor installs a Ring camera on his front door, and this camera has a view of most of the street. And movement within a distance of 25 feet is usually recorded and collected by Amazon. So what we tried to aim for with both of these examples were some sort of commonly used technologies that might violate privacy in certain ways that we want students to think about and talk about. So we follow up the class debates with a general discussion on privacy and data collection and consumption. On this slide, we start with a few questions. Who collects your data? Why do they collect it? And are there examples where this data collection violates yours or others' privacy? If students lack ideas, you might consider a few suggestions. Amazon Alexa is famous for collecting voice recording data from its users, as well as status information about things like smart light bulbs in the home. Ring cameras are intended to sort of record your own property, but also tend to record sort of like neighborhood streets past the user's own property. Targeted ads on specific platforms like Instagram and TikTok often use the user's web use beyond that platform. So these are a couple examples of cases where a user's data has been collected and maybe not used in the way the user was expecting, or in the way someone else that wasn't intending to be a user was expecting. We follow this up with the question, when do you think data collection crosses a line into a privacy violation? Students might base their answer off some of those examples, or they might bring in some other ideas. We followed that conversation up with another two questions, starting with research studies. So in some cases, collectors need to be really specific about the data they're collecting. And we asked students, do you think this should be true in every case? We follow that up with some specifics. What could data collectors do to better protect user privacy, or at least better inform users when their data is being collected? So we've talked a lot about data privacy, and now we're going to shift gears a little bit and switch over to representation. We start with an example. We start with a couple of study designs that focus on issues in representation. Our first one involves calling people on cell phones. So political polls used to be done by calling people on landlines. Now it's done with cell phones, which is theoretically a little better since that's what most people have. But we still think there's some issues with representation. So our first couple questions are, who is represented in these polls, who is not, and what makes someone more or less likely to be represented? If students don't have any ideas, some of the ideas we've gotten in past classes involved a lot of students telling us that they wouldn't pick up a call from an unknown number, and some students correctly pointing out that if a user doesn't have a cell phone, or their cell phone happens to be like not working or not charged, then they won't get that call. So they could be left out of that sample as well. We move on to polls that are done through social media, where common sites are Facebook and Twitter. Again, our question are, who is represented in these polls and who isn't? And we're trying to get at this idea that not representing certain populations could lead to issues with sort of sample generalization and things like that. Past students have told us that like Facebook, people who don't use Facebook and Twitter won't be represented in these polls. Teenagers love to call Facebook users old, so some students have told us that young people won't be represented in these polls at all, which I thought was kind of funny and might be somewhat true. And so there's lots of good things that students could think about when they're thinking about who's in the sample and who isn't. It might be especially helpful to ask them if they use Facebook and Twitter, because of course if they don't, they would be among the population that wouldn't be included in these polls. Finally, we're going to use facial recognition software as our last example here. This was largely trained using photos of white people. This has led to actually a lot of problems, often written about in news articles, which we're going to look at in a moment. So we asked these same questions, who's represented, who isn't, and could this lead to any problems? And then we're actually going to move over to some articles on this topic. So we have two articles here that students could read about issues in facial recognition software technology coming from problematic samples when these technologies were first trained. You could do the assignment in a couple different ways. Students could read the article that they want. You could split the class in half somehow, or you could like have small groups and have sort of half of each small group read one article or the other and discuss. Kind of up to you. We do recommend just that some students in the class are reading one article and some students are reading the other, because there are some interesting points in both. And these expand on the development and inequitable impact of facial recognition technology. We spend a few slides talking about misuse of data, defining specifically this term data misuse, which is when data is used differently from what was originally intended. We have a few examples and also make the point on this slide that data misuse can be malicious, which means data is being deliberately misused, or accidental. So there's a case where it's being unintentionally misused. We want students to be able to identify data misuse. So we bring up the Cambridge Analytica example where personal data belonging to millions of Facebook users was collected by this political consulting firm and used to assist the 2016 presidential campaigns of Ted Cruz and Donald Trump. wound up being that Facebook was fined $5 billion for the data misuse. This is a good chance for students to talk about sort of whether this is accidental or deliberate misuse, and also sort of identify who the misuser of data in this case was, and what the consequences of this were. In this case, this firm got a hold of a lot of data from Facebook, which Facebook probably used in a way that was different from expected, and then this firm used that to sort of enhance these presidential campaigns, probably prop up candidates more than they would have ordinarily. In our closing discussion, we try to wrap things back together, ask students why it's important to think about stakeholders in data collection and consumption. I think for all the reasons today, there's a lot of reasons why we would want to think about that. Why we would think about issues with privacy in data collection and use, and why we should think about representation in data collection and use. Today we have an exit ticket. I think we did not do this in the first class, so this is our first example. Again, there's a Google Forms icon indicating that this is present in the worksheet. I will stop saying that in one of these lessons. But what we have for our exit ticket today is a movie production company trying to see which of two new movie ideas will sell more tickets. What they do is they go to the local AMC, which is near a college campus, and survey people leaving from 1 p.m. to 6 p.m. and asking them which idea they prefer. We have two questions here that students can respond to: who is underrepresented, and why could the issue of representation bias the company's conclusions? So some potential answers that students might get, and I believe a couple of these are in the exit ticket as a key as well. But students might say things like, well, a lot of college students are going to get represented, but not a lot of adults at large. And also 1 p.m. to 6 p.m., especially if it's on a weekday, is a time that if you're leaving the movies, you probably don't have, say, like a 9-to-5 job. So anyone with that kind of position would be underrepresented here. And that could lead the movie production company to fund an idea that actually maybe a chunk of the population that would be likely to go see that movie, even if it's not at that particular time, doesn't actually like all that much. So there's some potential issues with this study design. As usual, on behalf of API Can Code, thanks for watching this video and for teaching our curriculum. See you next time.